There's a moment, just before a transport lands on a bad strip, when every man watching holds the same breath. On the Pranjani Plateau, sometime after midnight in late August 1944, hundreds of men did exactly that. Serbian peasants in worn shoes and patched trousers, Chetnik fighters with ammunition bandoliers crossing their chests, doctors and priests, and rows of downed American aircrew who'd been lost, found, and now might be found again. The flame pots marking the edges of the strip flickered in the breeze. At the far end, a signal fire burned low, ready to be doused if anything went wrong. Up the valley, if you knew where to look, you could see the dim glow of German garrison towns. On the roads between them, trucks and half-tracks moved, their drivers oblivious to what was happening in the dark hills above. Then someone pointed. Lights! Out of the black, 2 white pinpricks appeared in the sky, growing slowly, resolving into the landing lights of a C-47 Dakota on final approach. Inside that cockpit, 2 American pilots were doing their own sort of breathing exercise. No runway lights, no approach beacons, no radio direction finder guiding them onto a nice, long, level strip. Just the coordinates scribbled in a notebook, the faint ring of light where the Yugoslavs had arranged their fires, and the calm voice of a navigator saying, "We're committed. No go-around." The pilot eased back on the throttles, feeling for the stall just above the tree line. The C-47's wheels met Yugoslav soil for the first time with a jarring bump, then a roll, then a bone-shaking series of hops as the transport tried to decide whether this was earth or water. It stayed upright. Men on the ground exhaled. The Dakota rumbled to a stop, swung around gingerly at the far end, and came back toward the waiting crowd in a slow taxi that kicked dust into everyone's eyes. The cargo door swung open. For the men standing in that field, it looked like a hole torn in the side of the night itself. The first loads out were the worst cases. Wounded men who couldn't easily walk. Airmen with bad leg breaks from parachute landings. Guys who'd had field surgery in barns and caves with no anesthetic but homemade rakia. They were half carried, half dragged to the waiting C-47 and loaded onto wooden benches and the floor. A few looked back over their shoulders as they crossed the threshold, as if afraid that saying goodbye to Pranjani too openly would jinx the lift. The Serbs who had fed them, hidden them, bandaged them stood back a little, faces unreadable in the firelight. Some Americans tried halting Serbian words they'd picked up. Others just gripped rough farmers' hands and said, "Thank you," over and over, hoping tone would make up for vocabulary. When the aircraft was full, 10, 12, 15 souls depending on weight and nerve, the crew chief gave a thumbs up. Outside, the guerrillas who formed the perimeter tightened grips on their rifles. The pilot shoved the throttles forward. The C-47 roared back up the strip, tail rising, engines straining. Trees at the end of the plateau loomed. For a few seconds, the Dakota seemed to crawl rather than fly. Then it broke ground, cleared the far edge by what looked like inches, and climbed into the night. On the plateau, the men who'd stayed clapped each other on the back, one step closer to believing this wasn't some cruel dream. Then they settled in to wait for the next one. Operation Halyard didn't end in one night. It stretched over weeks, as weather, German troop movements, and fuel availability allowed. C-47 after C-47 came in, usually at night, sometimes brushing low cloud, sometimes riding dangerous winds up the valley. Each time, the process repeated. Perimeter set, flame pots lit, signal fire ready. Americans, lined up in chalks with whatever they could carry. Some had been in hiding for days, others for months. They told each other scraps of stories while waiting. I was hit over Ploieshti. My chute barely opened. I landed in a field, and this old woman ran out and dragged me into a root cellar just before a German patrol came up the lane. I spent 2 weeks in a cave. They'd bring bread at night. A kid maybe 10 years old would run messages between villages. They walked us for 3 nights straight to get here, only moved when it rained. Again and again, the same themes. Locals who had nothing, sharing everything. Chetnik guides who knew every goat path and gendarme schedule. Narrow escapes at roadblocks whose details still made men sweat telling them years later. Behind it all, the quiet awareness that if the Germans ever realized the scale of what was happening in this one little valley, they would level it. Bombers from Luftflotte 4. Artillery. Burned villages and hanged mayors as an example. Somehow, that never happened. Part of it was luck. Part of it was German focus shifting east as the Red Army chewed into their Balkan positions. Part of it was Mihailović's skill at diverting attention, staging harassment operations away from the strip. Whatever the combination, by the time the last C-47 lifted off from Pranjani, more than 500 Allied airmen had passed through that cargo door. No transport had been lost. No rescue flight intercepted. The biggest Allied airmen evacuation of the war had happened right under the noses of German occupation authorities who prided themselves on order and control. To them, those flyers were just names on dusty presumed dead lists. The truth was bumping over the Adriatic in C-47s and landing one after another on Italian soil. In Bari, field hospitals and debriefing centers suddenly had to make room for dozens, then hundreds of men whose units had written them off. There were physical checks, malaria, dysentery, injuries from ejections, and landings. There were intelligence debriefs, what they'd seen in Yugoslavia, what they'd heard about German movements, what they thought of the guerrilla forces who'd sheltered them. Again and again, the same names came up. Pranjani, Serbian peasants. Chetniks, Mihailović. For the rescued airmen, there was no ambiguity. These people had saved their lives. The politics of it bothered them a lot less than the memory of a peasant woman pressing bread into their hands with tears in her eyes. Years later, when Cold War lines were hardened and Mihailović had been executed by Tito's regime, many of those flyers still returned to Yugoslavia, now as old men, to visit the valley where they'd been kept alive. They stood on the Pranjani Plateau, ran their hands over the grass, tried to imagine the wild, desperate thing that had happened there under blackout skies. Some knelt and kissed the ground. Others hugged the grandchildren of the families who had hidden them. They knew they owed their lives not just to American pilots in C-47s and OSS officers in parachutes, but to farmers who'd risked collective punishment to hide strangers with funny accents. For decades, Operation Halyard was a mini-story inside the larger war. Too tangled in Balkan politics, too dependent on names, Western governments were trying to downplay. But at its core, it's simple. Hundreds of Allied airmen were written off as dead. They were not. They were alive because ordinary people in an extraordinary place decided to take them in. They got home because a few officers believed impossible radio messages, because 3 men jumped into the dark, and because a rough dirt field on a Serbian hillside proved just long enough for a Dakota's wheels. If you use this as a 3-part series, each part can end with a soft prompt. If you want to see how they actually got those C-47s in and out under the Germans' noses, don't miss part 2. If you want to know what happened when the first Dakotas touched down on that hillside strip, watch part 3. That's how you keep people writing the story all the way from presumed killed in action to back home, years later saying thank you.